Hi guys, welcome back to Reserved Investments on YouTube. So as promised in other videos, I want to talk a little bit about the vintage toy market, mainly the action figures and toys produced from the late 1970s all the way up through the early 1990s. If you're wondering why I'm using that as a particular cutoff, it's because when we refer to vintage toys in the greater antiques and collectibles trade, we could be talking about other facets of the vintage toy market. For instance, space toys and robots that were made in Japan that were popular in the 1950s and 60s also count as vintage toys, as does a lot of model train sets, vintage trains, slot cars, die-cast cars, items of that nature. So what I want to talk about specifically in this particular video when I refer to vintage toys is pretty much the popular action figures, play sets, and vehicles that came out in the late 1970s all the way up through the early 1990s. So I'm pretty much covering everything from vintage Kenner Star Wars figures, play sets, vehicles, all the way up through and including Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That was probably what I consider, in my opinion, and again, other people will disagree with me, but in my opinion, the vintage original Playmates Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles line is probably where I put the end of what I call the coveted era of vintage toys and action figures. The series premiered in the late 1980s, and it ran all the way into the early 1990s. And after that toy line was pretty much finalized and done, I really don't see any other collectible toy lines coming out right after that particular toy line that gave enough credence or credibility to be included in the coveted era of what I call vintage toy collecting. Okay? Now obviously, when we talk about vintage toys, we do have to bring up, and again, I'm going to do another video on this topic, the subject of the Toy Hunter based reality television show that had a huge impact on a lot of the vintage toy lines that came out during the 1970s all the way up through the 1990s. And yes, I know that show also covered some of the toy lines that came out in the 1960s and even some of the toy lines that came out after the 1990s as well. That said, Toy Hunter did a great job at stroking the nostalgia nerve, meaning a lot of people that watched that show were kind of brought back to either their childhoods, or they were able to envision owning the toys that they had as a kid and they wanted to buy them again. So Toy Hunter did, during its short run, because it ran from 2012 to 2014, it did bring a lot of collectors and speculators back into the market. Okay? Now, what everybody wants me to comment on is what I call the Big Five. The Big Five in the vintage toy realm are really vintage Kenner Star Wars, Masters of the Universe, HeMan, Transformers, preferably Generation 1, G.I.Joe, that came out in the 80s, not the 60s. The 1980s line is a lot more popular among collectors my age and younger in that regard. And also, of course, I already mentioned it, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So what I'm going to do in this video, rather than talk in general terms of every single subject matter in the vintage toy world, I'm going to break down the top five that I just mentioned, go over where I see the markets are currently for those particular collecting toy categories, and also give you my feedback in an upcoming video on some of the other more obscure toy lines like Mask, Sectaris, Starcom, Supernaturals, Visionaries, Madballs, Battle Beasts. All that will be covered in a separate video, guys. Okay? And I'm doing that on purpose because if I were to do a complete video on just the one subject matter of focusing on vintage toys from the 70s to the 90s, it would be an hour and a half long video, and nobody would even watch it to the end. Therefore, let's start with vintage Star Wars, okay? Vintage Star Wars figures are actually not, in most cases, any longer in a speculative bubble. what happened was back in 2012 when Toy Hunter was going strong, another event happened that caused a catalyst in that particular collecting subcategory. And I'm sure you guys know what it is. Disney released and announced that they had acquired all the rights to Lucasfilm, including, obviously, the coveted Star Wars franchise. And at that time when the news broke, it was actually October 2012. It was 1 month before the election between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. And when it was announced, it caused a lot of people to come back in to the Star Wars marketplace, and it drove prices up temporarily on a lot of the vintage items, because what a lot of the speculators got wrong is they assumed that because Disney was going to start making more movies, that would cause an eternal, everlasting demand in the vintage Star Wars line. Well, that's not realistic, guys, and here's why. A person who's born in 2019, or let's even go back 20 years, 1999, okay, their correlation to vintage Star Wars, if they're born in 1999, is more or less going to be the prequels, okay? Yes, they're going to have exposure to the original movies that came out in the late 70s and the early 80s. However, again, I have to go back and reiterate, a collector is not made. A collector is born. So number one, not only would they have to already be a collector at heart, but number two, they would also have to have some type of attachment to the toys that were released in the 70s and 80s. Well, I can tell you statistically, it's just not realistic to think that someone's going to grow up, be obsessed with one particular collecting field and or pop culture icon, and specifically collect that one item and go back decades before they were born and start to accumulate items from that era. Some people will. There's always exceptions. But if you look at other collecting categories, okay, it's not typical to happen in that realm unless the items are truly historic. And I hate to say this, but as much as I love Star Wars, as much as the next guy loves Star Wars, yes, it is the most popular film franchise of all time, okay? No doubt about it. That said, that doesn't mean everybody wants to collect it, okay? There's a lot of caveats with collecting vintage toys that I'm going to cover in another video. For instance, you have to be very careful if you're buying factory sealed items, if you're buying graded items. The items do deteriorate over time. And I don't think a lot of the so-called sophisticated investors that are coming into the hobby realize that there's a lot more risks with collecting vintage toys than there are collecting vintage comic books, coins, and currency. And that needs to be looked at, so I'm going to do a separate video to address that in particular, okay? I did write an article for Antiques and Auction News in that regard about risks investing and speculating in vintage toys. The article did very well. I got a lot of positive feedback on that particular article, so I will cover it in another future video, okay? That said, the thing that you have to understand about Star Wars figures were, and toys, AFA graded or not, were on an uphill climb ever since 2012 when Disney announced that they were going to do new Star Wars movies. Now here's an interesting thing. When The Force Awakens hit in 2015, a lot of the prices started actually dropping, except on the high value, what do I want to say, quote unquote rare items. So the stuff like a carded vinyl cape Jawa, okay, that item has increased exponentially across the board. So has, obviously, if you're lucky enough to own a rocket-firing Boba Fett prototype action figure, that item has increased a lot across the board. Toy Hunter, if you remember the very first episode back in 2012, they found a loose rocket-firing Boba Fett prototype action figure, and I think they were selling it for anywhere from $12,000 to $17,000, which even ungraded, if it was in near mint minus condition, would have been a steal in today's prices. That said, if you have a loose vinyl cape Jawa, a loose Luke Skywalker double telescoping figure, a lot of that stuff has actually remained flat across the board. Even proof cards. Proof card collecting became a little bit popular. in 2012, 13, and 14 with Revenge of the Jedi proofs. For those of you unaware, Revenge of the Jedi was the original name of Return of the Jedi. Well, George Lucas felt that a Jedi shouldn't seek revenge, so he changed the name of the movie to Return of the Jedi. So Kenner, the company that produces the action figures, made backings to the action figures that say Revenge of the Jedi on them. Well, at one point, back in the 1980s, they actually sold them through the Star Wars Club, where you could have got proof cards that are now worth hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for $10 a piece, or $20 a piece. It was somewhere around that at the time. Well, today, obviously, they do have value. The problem is, most of the proof cards are readily available on the market. If you check Hake's auctions, you can get a good price history of what some of the AFA 85 and 90 Revenge of the Jedi proof cards sold for, and you can get a good price comparison across the board. And I will tell you this, in the last 2 years, for a lot of the proof cards out there on the market, they actually tanked in value. Unless you had a really popular character, like a Princess Leia or a Boba Fett, you really didn't do that well investment-wise by buying something that's considered uncommon or esoteric on the market. And the reason for that, guys, is not too many people who are collecting vintage Star Wars figures are actively pursuing proof cards. They're more going after the figures, the play sets, items of that nature. It's more of an esoteric collecting field. So you have to keep that in mind. So to answer the question on Star Wars, most Star Wars action figures from the vintage era are not a good investment right now. The money's already been made. I'll let you in on a little secret. Between the years 2016 and 2018, I sold off 95% of my vintage toy collection. And that included a lot of my high-grade vintage Star Wars pieces, meaning I had almost every 12-back and 21-back action figure made, factory sealed, in AFA 85 or 90 condition. Okay, sold it all. I did keep some prototype items in a safety deposit box that are AFA graded and certified, just because I feel the market's fairly low on them still. But honestly, as I analyze the market even 5, 10, 15 years from down the line, I don't think prices are going to go any higher on that, because let's be realistic. What catalyst is going to cause Star Wars items to go higher than what they are now? You already had the acquisition with Disney. You already have a Disney theme park devoted to Star Wars opening in California and Florida. What else is going to cause prices to go higher? There just isn't one, guys, in my opinion. Be very careful if you're speculating in that market. You have to have a realistic time frame and an exit plan for your holdings. Passing them down from generation to generation isn't going to do you any good, because they're eventually going to get to someone and they're going to say, why the heck did this person leave me a collection of vintage Star Wars items that I have no attachment to, my kids have no attachment to, and nobody we know was alive when they came out? So just be careful in that market, okay? Let's talk He-Man. He-Man Masters of the Universe was a surprise hit for Mattel. The line debuted in the early 1980s, and it was kind of at a time where Star Wars was already starting to die off, meaning Return of the Jedi was running its course, and people were really getting kind of sick of the whole outer space theme of toys, of action figures. Star Trek was stale at this time. So when He-Man premiered, Mattel did a great job at creating an original property and promoting it. That said, a lot of people were not speculating on He-Man when it first hit store shelves back in the early 1980s. That's why if you see some of the early, I want to say 8-backs, I think the He-Man line, the original figures that appeared were 8-backs, because there were 8 figures produced originally that hit the market. They would be equivalent to the Star Wars 12-back figures. That said, a lot of them are very hard to find today, and they go for several thousands of dollars on the secondary market if they're AFA graded, factory sealed, in near mint or better condition, with no yellowing on the bubble. That's important, guys. One of the risks to investing in vintage toys, mainly action figures, is that the bubbles attached to the card, if you're collecting factory sealed action figures, will yellow over time. There are exceptions to the rule, but I'm even seeing now a lot of 12-back figures I'm seeing are literally yellowing on the card, which is cause for concern. Keep in mind, guys, these items, any type of toy, action figure, playset, it was cheaply made and mass produced. It wasn't meant to keep factory sealed for 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years into the future. It was meant to be ripped open, enjoyed by a kid, and then either taken to the landfill or passed down to another generation if they so desired. It was not meant to be stored in a plastic tomb. It was not meant to be stored anywhere, because eventually the products that they used to seal vintage toys and action figures, whether we're talking play sets or whether we're talking the actual figures themselves, we're referring to the bubble on the card, eventually that glue that is holding that item in place is going to wear off. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. So those of you that are sinking $2,000, $3,000 in a Star Wars figure, you have to be cognizant to understand that it's probably best some point in your life that you sell that figure on the marketplace. And you understand that it's not a good long-term investment, not only for that reason, but just other reasons that I specified. He-Man is in a similar boat as Star Wars, except Star Wars has more awareness in the realm of pop culture and public consciousness, obviously. Now, I am aware they are trying to reboot the He-Man franchise for younger audiences. That said, guys, again, younger audiences are going to connect with the product that's on the market today. They're not going to connect with the stuff overall that was released back in the 1980s. Okay? That's a problem that I think a lot of toy collectors have, because none of the toy collectors that I talk to take a look back. Okay? We can go back all the way to the early 1900s in regards to toys. German handmade marbles were popular around the turn of the 1900s, that particular era. So were certain toy trains. Okay? There's a lot of toys that you can look at through the years that dropped off, that everybody thought were the next big thing, and it never materialized. Or it materialized for several decades, then prices fell. You know, I've said this before. I would not recommend anybody going out and starting a collection of Lionel toy trains right now. It's a bunch of baby boomers that are selling this stuff at auction to other baby boomers, and no younger collectors are coming into the market. Now is not a time to buy Lionel toy trains and related collectibles. If you want to buy a toy train in 2019, do yourself a favor. Get yourself a Lego toy train, okay? At least, worst case scenario, you'll always have a buyer, at least for the next 10, 20, or 30 years to sell it to. I'm not saying it's a good investment. No. But what I'm saying is, if you buy something of that nature, there's always a buyer on the market for that you can easily flip it to right now. That market can change. There's risks in the Lego market as well. Another video. That said, I would not tell anybody to start a toy train collection today. Okay? It's the same thing with space robots and toys, tin toys from the 1950s and 60s. The market is almost collapsing on anything but the more rare or uncommon items, and those items over the coming years are going to have a very limited market to sell to, where their prices are going to drop exponentially. It has to happen. Very few younger collectors are coming at age in their 20s and 30s going, I want to collect Japanese space toys from the 1950s and 60s. It's just not happening. So back to He-Man. That is one caution on the market, even if they successfully relaunched the brand. Younger collectors are not going to feel attached to the line that came out in the 1980s. They're going to want the stuff that came out today. That said, there are exceptions to every rule. Mattel did a great job with the Masters of the Universe line of classics that they released several years back. That's a great line. Would I invest in it today? No. The market is very weak for those type of items because the adult collectors that are pursuing them are my age, even older, and possibly a little younger. And I'm 42. Okay? So I caution people, and this is going to be a common theme throughout this video, I hate to say, be very careful what you're buying in that regard. There may always be a buyer, but it may not be at the price level that you expect or the price level that you paid for the item. Okay? Now let's talk about G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe I have a fond relationship with because that was my favorite toy line growing up. I thought Hasbro did an excellent job with a lot of the characters, the vehicles, especially on the Cobra side. I really liked watching also the vintage cartoon. I'm still a fan of it to this day. If you go back and watch it, guys, you're going to find out that it's not politically correct, which is what I love about it. I mean, there's scenes where Destro's making out with the Baroness. There's scenes where some of the G.I. Joes, who are supposedly the good guys, are hitting on women. I mean, it's just, watching it today, it's like, oh my gosh, it really is from a different time period, you know? It really takes me back to my youth. So, I really enjoy the G.I. Joe vintage line. That said, again, I'm going to give you some advice. If you're investing in that line, for the first 2 years, 1982 and 1983, when the figures hit the market, most people were not saving them factory sealed. Some people were. That said, a lot of those figures are the more uncommon pieces that command a lot of value if they're factory sealed, especially if they're AFA graded, on the secondary marketplace. Late G.I. Joe figures and vehicles from, I want to say, 1987, 1988, 1989 were hoarded en masse. Be very careful if you're going past Series 4. Maybe Series 5 you can collect a little bit, but most of the items released past that are very common on the secondary market, whether they're AFA graded, factory sealed, or not. A lot of people make the mistake and they think, oh no, it's G.I. Joe, it's vintage, it has to be worth something, and they overpay for those items. I can tell you, you can get AFA Near Mint Plus graded factory sealed figures from Series 4 up on average in the vintage 80s G.I. Joe line for $200 to $300 a figure. It's not going to break the bank. I will tell you this though, a lot of those bubbles will eventually yellow. They have to be maintained in a climate-controlled environment out of sunlight. So you have to be very careful if you're buying that stuff for investment, because even in an AFA graded case, okay, the bubble on any action figure can still turn yellow and deteriorate. AFA cases do not protect against full light damage and or protect it from the elements, okay? Keep that in mind if you're going into that market. Now let's talk about the one that I get asked the most. Transformers. Generation 1 Transformers have some type of an emotional viability in a lot of the people my age who grew up with them. One thing is for certain, when Transformers came out in, I want to say 1984, okay, I think that's when they premiered Generation 1 in the US. They were unlike any other toy line ever created, okay? They were coveted by a lot of collectors, and here's why. Back in 1984, it was unrealistic to have a toy that sold on store shelves, factory sealed, for $39.99 on average. That's what a lot of the popular Transformers of that era sold for. Soundwave, Starscream, Optimus Prime I think was even more expensive, as was Megatron. So a lot of people, when that toy line came out, did not rush to the store, buy 5 Megatrons, and keep them factory sealed. That's why those items, when you see them in near mint condition factory sealed and AFA graded, sell for $3,000 to $4,000 a figure on average. There are deals to be had. Sometimes one will go for $2,000, maybe $2,200. I know I saw a Soundwave once that was AFA graded and all near mint or better subgrades go for something like $1,800, which was a steal. That said, guys, you have to understand again, that appeals to Generation X and millennials to a certain degree. Mostly, though, younger collectors are not going to covet those items the way that you do. Now, a question I get asked again is a follow-up to that. How many years out do you see the trend continuing? I still want to say you have 10 to 20 years before there is any type of significant downturn in a lot of these markets. That said, keep in mind though, guys, new collectors are not going to come in masse in any of these markets. There's no catalyst to bring them in. The Transformer movies, in my opinion, that recently came out by Michael Bay, they really didn't match the original toy line. I am not a fan of the Transformer movies. I like the Star Wars movies. I like the G.I.Joe movies. But I'm going to be honest, I was very disappointed in the Transformers movies. I don't even watch them anymore. That said, younger collectors are going to attach more to items that came up during their time, their generation. They're not going to be going after, en masse, meaning on average, items from the 1980s because, oh, Transformers are still relevant today. One of the mistakes that a lot of collectors and speculators do this all the time, well, you don't understand, it's relevant today. That doesn't mean that somebody who is born into today's world is going to want to grow up and collect items that came out 20 to 30 years ago. It's not working in that manner, okay? That's why when I talk about coins, currency, historical documents, art, collectible first edition books, these are all items that have more of a universal appeal, okay? Stuff like toys, comic books, tastes change. Tastes are fickle. Be careful what you're buying. Yes, I know, and I don't want to get off topic on this, but one of the arguments I keep hearing, Sean, Superman, Batman, they're almost 80 years old. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. You are correct, but I'm telling you, 3, 4, 500 years from now, which I know some of you think I'm ridiculous for pointing that out, I assure you, kids growing up are not going to have any relevance to Batman or Superman. It's going to happen. It's going to fall out of flavor. You are looking at your life, and this is something that most people do. I myself do this. You're analyzing it from the standpoint, crap, I was born, 1976 for me. So I'm looking at my life, and I'm looking into the future, and I go, well, let's say I live to 90, okay? Sometime in 2060 or what have you, okay, I'm probably going to die at some point, let's be honest, if I even live that long, okay? Looking at my life, it's far easier to analyze what I know more than what I don't know. I don't know what's coming in the year 2100, okay? I know that some of you watching this are thinking I'm crazy to bring that up, but you have to understand, the greater antiques and collectibles trade, time matters. Time is both an enemy and a friend. It may not matter to you in that type of relevance, okay? But it does to younger collectors and generations that are coming up the pipeline continuously. This is why I don't recommend, like people say, I want to open up a vintage toy museum. The term vintage for you is going to mean something entirely different than someone born in 2019 to 2020, okay? There's no point in opening up a vintage museum geared towards toys. I'm going to be very honest. There's already vintage toy museums out there. They're great. They do a great job at catering to the market. You cannot go out and buy everything in the realm of vintage toys, call it an investment, and think it's going to continuously go up in value. That's a fool's game. So let's talk about now Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was great when it came out in the late 1980s. The problem is they changed how the brand is presented over the years. They kept reinventing the line, not just in the toys, but also the animated series when it premiered on Nickelodeon. They kept reinventing it to the point that today's collectors or people who are enthusiasts of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that weren't around in the 1980s and 90s when Bebop, Rocksteady, Krang, a lot of the more risque characters were there, don't have any association to what it was like back then. That's the problem with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They kept recreating the brand over and over. I mean, the comic book's great. I love the original black and white comic book where they all had guns, believe it or not. That was spectacular. The toy line, I thought Playmates and also the owners of the property at the time did a great job handling it originally. But then when they tried to relaunch it again and again, that's where it kind of lost me. I don't like any of the modern Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movies either. I like the original movie that came out back in what, 1990, 1989? Thought that was a classic. So again, if you're going to invest in this stuff, I'm not telling you don't have time. But what I am telling you is watch price trends and understand that if something's been going for $1,000 or $1,500 for the past 3 to 4 or 5 years, chances are there's nothing that's going to change where that item's going to go up in value. And that's true if you're talking about a $300 item, a $3,000 item, or a $30,000 item. You know, I could do a whole video on my thoughts on Mego collecting. Mego collecting at some point here is going to die out pretty soon. It is on a downward trend. That said, there are still people that are collecting Megos because it's a cross collectible with the comic book guys, with a lot of the vintage toy guys, okay? I would not be going out buying the Wizards of Oz Mego figures and thinking they're going to be a great investment. Just saying. So this is a topic I will expand on in other upcoming videos, okay? I just wanted to put my thoughts out there now that we're at 30 minutes on this video at what I think about the vintage toy market. Again, it's a very risky market. Yes, it's not dying out anytime soon. All the properties that I mentioned are safe for the next several decades. That said, our price is going to rise on a lot of those items. Really, the big money in the vintage toy market is following the quote-unquote rare or higher-end items. And I know that some of you are going to hate me for saying this. Spending $3,000 on an item in the vintage toy market is not really high-end or uncommon. So you have to look at it that way, all right? I want to thank everybody who has subscribed to my channel. I want to thank everybody who has left a comment, whether it's been constructive or not. I also want to thank you guys for all the likes and any of the commentary that you left that got me thinking in another way for upcoming videos. Again, I've said this before. If you like my content that I produce, if you like the channel, please consider subscribing. I am listening to all your feedback, good or bad, whether I agree, disagree, whether I respond or I don't. I appreciate the comments, guys. Thank you so much, and have a great night.